It is my pleasure welcoming you to our 16th convergence of our online series of talks and conversations. And for those of you tuning in for the first time, the series manifests as a glossary and proposes a weekly practice of critical engagement. Each week expands on a series of 20 keywords that have informed the biennial's curatorial proposition, and really they explore how words make worlds and how we can articulate multiple and open-ended imaginaries. So this week is dedicated to the word metamorphosis and life, what we imagine as being the most essential, indescribable, and intimate about ourselves, according to our speaker this evening, has nothing exclusive or personal about it. In fact, it overlooks the logic of individuality. Instead, the life that animates us has animated other bodies, other matter. It is simultaneously present and successive. It is transmitted and circulated equally between individuals, species, the living and the non-living. So the philosopher Emmanuel Cochilla, who is joining us tonight, will elaborate on this constant exposure and reconfiguration this evening, and will also help us articulate how life's continuity invites us to welcome transformation, which indeed is the very fact that allows us to meet online today. So I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge our viewers who are tuning in from André-Sala in Riga. Our talk this evening, as some of you might know, was planned to happen in the exhibition on site with you. And an exhibition that, as you know, opened despite our wildest beliefs. I'd like to show my gratitude to everyone who's been relentlessly working with us online and on site, to Reboca's founder and commissioner, and to Rebecca Lamarche Vadel, Reboca's chief curator, who I have the immense pleasure to co-imagine the series with. So finally, an enormous thank you to Emmanuel Cochilla, whose thinking has greatly inspired this series. Emmanuel is a philosopher based in Paris, where he teaches at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences. His studies departed from the 12th century polymath and jurist Averrois, and his research turned into the ontological status of images and their regulatory power, and later towards an investigation of life. Emmanuel has published numerous books translated into several languages, including Sensible Life from 2011, The Good in Things from 2014, and the bestseller The Life of Plants, a Metaphysics of Mixture from 2018, which has been translated into 10 languages, hopefully in Latvian soon. Earlier this year, Emmanuel published Metamorphosis, and he collaborated on editorial projects with the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and lectures widely, appearing equally in academic seminars, in contemporary art forums, and in public media as well. And without further ado, my heartfelt gratitude for connecting with us today, and please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Cochilla. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Sophia, for your kind presentation. Thank you, Laima, and all the staff for the invitation. I'm very proud and happy to be here. Thank you to all the public, that you are there listening to me in Riga. I'm very sad not to be there. I was very happy to come there, but unfortunately it's not possible, and for, of course, very reasonable reasons. So since I will talk via Zoom, I decided not to read in order to make our talk a little bit in a way audible for you. And the proposal of my talk will actually to show just one thesis, just the idea that actually the life that informs and makes alive all kind of beings is one of the same, that actually all living beings share one and the same flesh. So it could sound a little bit paradoxical, but I hope that once that I finish the talk, you are convinced of that. So, and I will proceed in 3 steps. I will first of all take just one very sensitive example of a very trivial case in nature, that is the metamorphosis of insects, and then I will show that this very paradoxical relationship that binds within insects and within the life of an individual 2 different bodies, so the caterpillar and the butterfly, is exactly the same relationship that relies all individuals within one species and all species altogether. But let's proceed with the first case. So with the example, very common example of metamorphosis. So you all experienced that for the first time, probably as a children in the garden of your house or in the countryside. So the fact that a caterpillar, so in a way, a being similar to a worm, can become something totally different, a butterfly. So in a way, if you take a caterpillar and a butterfly, those two beings don't share anything, neither from an anatomical point of view, nor from an ethical point of view, nor for an ecological point of view. I explain. So yeah, they are two totally different forms and silhouettes. They actually have two different life forms. The caterpillar is a machine which is able to digest everything and who is conducting a life as if nature was a huge McDonald's, so just eating. And on the opposite, the butterfly is sex machine, is in a way as someone who is just looking for other exemplars of or other individuals of the species in order to have sex. So they have two totally different moral identities. And they also live in two different and incompatible worlds, because since the caterpillar lives on the ground and is spending his time crawling on the ground, and the world of a butterfly is the much more aerial world, so it's just flying around in the air. And that's probably, from a biological point of view, the reason why insects pass through metamorphosis, in order to avoid the competition between adults and children. Now, they have these two bodies who have two different anatomies, two different ethos, two different moral forms and attitudes, but also they who inhabit two different worlds are actually one and the same person. So what is interesting in the case of metamorphosis is the fact that it shows at least two things, two important points for the consideration of life. First of all, that what we call life is actually this relationship of continuity between different forms, different identities, and so on. But more importantly, is the fact that in a way, if you are looking life from the point of view of insects, you will learn that you can never reduce life to a single identity from an anatomical point of view to a single face, to a single visage, but neither from a moral point of view. So in a way, life is never a single face, a single identity, but it's also never a single life form. So you are never identified from an ethos, from a moral identity, nor from a word. So life is always what passes from an ethos to another, from a word to another. So life is always between worlds, between forms, between ethos, different ethos. But what I wanted, now that you, in a way, have in mind this case, I would like to show you that, in a way, the same relationship that relies the caterpillar and the butterflies is the relationship that, first of all, relies all individuals of one species. So the evidence that is what I'm saying, that above or besides or differences of forms from an anatomical point of view, from a moral point of view, from a, in a way, ecological point of view, there is a continuity that is never broken. So this continuity can be seen within the individuals of the same species in the fact of birth. So perhaps is a fact that we are living in a sexist world, which in a way was made by males for males, and our culture is also a culture made by males and for males, where the women were totally excluded. And one of the symptoms of this sexism actually is the fact that we are obsessed by death, and we are speaking all the time about death, but we totally, in a way, neglect birth. So you can find a lot of films, a lot of philosophical texts or works on death. You can find a lot of work of art about death, but you will hardly find films, poetry, poems, work of art about birth. So birth is in a way a taboo, also because in a social sense, because there is a lot of rituals about death. So common spaces where you can share the experience of death, but there is no real rituals. I mean, apart from religious rituals, that allows us to share birth. So it's not easy to think about birth, but actually, yes, birth is, from a biological point of view, perhaps the most common feature of all living beings. So you know that what we call nature, so it's actually the sum of the collection of living beings who share the fact of being born. The word nature comes from the same root in Latin of the word which is used in order to say being born. So nature is what in a way has this feature, has what can live only through birth. So first of all, birth is interesting because it's the most universal property of living beings. All living beings has to be born in order to live. And secondly, this universal feature is actually something which is extremely interesting. Why? Because birth, if you're looking at it, if you're thinking about it, is actually the fact that in order to be someone, you have to take the body, the flesh, the DNA of another living being. You have, in a way, to repeat a life who has already taken place. So the fact that we are born, so all of us has experienced the birth, but it means literally that we have, for instance, for the length of 9 months, we were the same body, the same flesh, the same breath of our mother. So we were the same organism. So in a way, birth is exactly that. I am the same body of someone who has already lived. And I have to repeat a second time. So it's a second try. So birth obliges, in a way, every living being to live with the same body a second time. In our case, since we are all the result of sexual reproduction, so we are repeating 2 different lives a second time. So this is extremely interesting because it proves, as I said, that there is a strong continuities between all lives. So it proves that the life which in a way gives life to our body is much more ancient than our body. So in a way, the lives which is in me is actually ancient, or has an age which coincides with the age of life on Earth. Because if you think about that, so my life has started not with the beginning of my body, because of the birth, the life that animates my body was already there when I was born. So the life has started, my life has started when the life of my mother has started. But since my mother has also been, was also been born, so her life was also more ancient, so older than her own body. So, and you can come up to the beginning of life on the earth. So that means that through birth, each of us is a vehicle, in a way, is a vehicle of the same life of the first living being on earth. So we are all at the same time extremely old and extremely young. So we have very young body, but also a very, very old life. So in a way, we are all in a way, not resurrection, but the reincarnation of the one of the same life who appeared on Earth a long time ago. What is interesting is also, so this is in a way, the evidence of the fact that birth produced this kind of continuity that, and it shows that the fact that life is first of all this transmission of a same, in a way, principle from body to body, from individual to individuals within the same species. What is also interesting about the fact that, in a way, speaking or thinking about birth, is the fact that actually, because of the fact that we are totally obsessed by death, we are obsessed by aging, by the idea of aging, and we, in a way, we forgot the fact that a living body is also able to rejuvenating. So what we call birth is also a very strange and very interesting process of rejuvenating one's own body. Because if you think about that, what does it mean to give birth to another living being? It means that some bodies, so the female body, the woman within the human species, is able to rejuvenate her own body. In a way, the body of a woman is able to rewind her own history till the day first and to oblige this rejuvenated body to live again one more time. So life is able to do that, to, in a way, to delete, to erase history and age, and to start again in an autonomous way. So birth is exactly this kind of process. But I will go fast, but I hope that it will be, that there will be space for questions and explanations also in the Q&A session. So the other place, or the other, the other place where we can, in a way, see this link of continuity among all living beings are two. The evolution and nutrition. So first, and in both cases, we are, in a way, we can witness the fact that all living beings are, in a way, in a continuity indifferently from their species. So this kind of continuity that relies a butterfly, a caterpillar and a butterfly is not just existing within individuals of the same species, is also existing among all species. So I forgot to mention, in a way, all what I said about birth can be resumed with the idea that all of us is a butterfly of a previous caterpillar, or to be more precise, in a way, I'm the butterfly of two caterpillars, of my father and my mother. And my daughter, for instance, I have a little daughter of 5 years, which is who is 5 years old, is also my kind of butterfly, so butterfly of me and of a mother. So, but let's come back to the evolution. In a way, one of the most interesting meaning or consequences of Darwin's theory of evolution is the idea that that actually all every species is the metamorphosis of a previous existing species. In a way, so we also can witness it also on our own bodies. So the human species is not something which has been born from nothing. We are just a modification, a little bit modification of a previous species. We are a butterfly of a previous existing caterpillar species, a primate species. And the evidence of that is the fact that each species, in a way, carries the elements of its previous species or of the previous existing species which produced the other species. So, for instance, we have a lot of elements of all the species that life has passed through in order to produce humanity. So, for instance, and you can see it through the DNA analysis. For instance, if you're looking to your DNA, you can see really a patchwork of very different life form of species, which means that we are not, that each species is actually in itself a sort of walking zoo. So we are, all of you are walking zoo. We are a patchwork of different species, but we can also witness it just looking at the mirror. If you're looking at a mirror every morning when you are waking up, you are seeing so eyes and noses and a nose to ears and so on. All those organs are not specifically human. So all those organs, we share all those organs with thousands of other species. But that means something which is extremely interesting. That means that all these organs, so all our body, in a way, give access to us to a life which is in itself biodiverse. So our body gives us a life which is in a way already multi-specific. So we do not need to meet an individual of another species in order to experience biodiversity or multi-specificity. Multi-specificity is something which is internal, immanent to every species because of the fact of evolution. Something very similar is something we can experience also through nutrition. Why? So nutrition is also something which is in a way a sort of very strange and taboo argument within our society, because we are actually accustomed to reduce nutrition to sacrifice, to an experience of death. So every time that we are speaking about nutrition, we are speaking about the fact that someone is in a way dying in order to give life to another organism. But we, in a way, we forget this second truth, the fact that nutrition is not just the experience of death, it's the experience of the fact that the life which used to be in one species is able to give life to another species. So nutrition is the transmission of life. And what is so scandalous or paradoxical in nutrition is the fact that every time you are eating something, you are experiencing or you are contemplating the identity of your life, your own life, and the life which is, for instance, in a chicken or in a cow or in a salad and so on. So in a way, nutrition is the evidence of the fact that the life which is within us is exactly the life which lies in the depth of a chicken or an animal or a plant. Is exactly this transmission, this in a way a passage of life from one species to another species is what makes possible life on Earth. So every day, in a way, life is passing from a species to another. Life is reincarnating from a species to another, and every individual is, through the act of nutrition, constructing a sort of common flesh. If you want the experience of nutrition, every time that you are eating, you are producing the identity of the flesh of different species. You are producing a sort of huge leviathan which collects in your own body, so the flesh of an infinite number of different species. So also from this point of view, you can in a way witness the equivalence, the identity, the continuity of the flesh, not just of the life, of the body of every single species. I come to the conclusion in order to give space to the questions. So why it is interesting to stress this continuity among all living things? because I think that this is the only possible ground of an ethic, of an ethical gaze or a fanatical attitude towards living beings in general. Because I think that the only condition of possibility of respect of the other living beings is the consideration of the fact that all other living beings are living exactly the same life we are living. And if you in a way, all living beings are a sort of immense, huge archive of our past and our future lives. So all of us are in a way animated by the same life, and our flesh will pass one day in the life of another living being. So that's why I think we have to reconsider this continuity among all living beings. Thanks.
Thank you, Manuel. This was it was quick, intense, enlightening, all at once. So thanks so much. And I think one of the things that came through to me is how it beautifully extends the premises of ecofeminist thought as well, showing us how, as living beings, we're able to give birth to other life forms, and how our lives are entangled to each other and to those of other species. So one of the great influences that we had in conceiving this series was looking at Lynn Margulis, the great biologist, and her theory of symbiogenesis, with the coming together of single-celled organisms in the formation of nucleated cells. But also one more recent sort of reference is the work of Peter Kropotkin, the Russian naturalist and anarchist philosopher, whose theory of mutual aid, of mutually beneficial cooperation and reciprocity has been gaining a lot of traction in the recent protests against anti-Black violence. So both of these, speaking from very different time periods, from very different experiences, ideological systems, had one idea in mind, that both animal and plant kingdoms and human societies evolve through cooperation. So my question here is, what are the implications that you imagine your theory of metamorphosis has for the question of care, of how we relate to each other, as well as for vegetal and animal life?
I would say that what could follow from this side, or from this idea that every living being is related to another through this process of metamorphosis, or from this insight that every living being shares one and the same life, or one and the same flesh with all of other living beings, is the evidence that that is not just in a way a question of collaboration. So it's not just a question of cooperation, so of doing something together with other living beings. So it's not just a question of pragmatical construction of a common world. We are already one and the same life, and that's why, in a way, the care of every living being for itself, or for or coincides with the care of for other living beings. So in a way, when we are caring, or to care about your own life, to care about your own flesh, means to care or about the flesh of the other living beings. Because when you're carrying animals, when you're carrying vegetables or plants, you're not carrying different lives. You are carrying, in a way, your own body, or the flesh that, in a way, was human in a past time, or will be human again. So in a very short future. So also because this very interesting link, this trophic link among all living beings. So this is perhaps because this is one of the obsession of in the history of ecological thinking So ecology was always obsessed by nutrition, by the fact that all living beings are in a way eating reciprocally all the time. But starting from the 40s, this evidence was in a way translated in a thermodynamic way. So the question was the transmission of energy, which was interesting for a lot of reasons because it allowed us to understand a lot of processes, but which is a false metaphor because living beings are not or do not need energy. So we are not needing energy. We are not because otherwise it could be possible to stick our hands in a electric device and to in a way to be fine with nutrition. It would be wonderful actually, but no, we do not need just energy. We are always eating living beings, so we are eating life. So but that means that this bond actually that nutrition produces every day or every instant of the earth history is the bond of the construction of one and the same flesh. So in a way, through nutrition, the flesh or the body of one species pass to be the life on the flesh of another species. So we really share everything. And that's why we have to care of the health of every living being, because it's our body. So in a way, it's not our body just for a very, very short period of time. So sooner or later, it will be the body of someone of us. So so that's why I would say that in a way we have to be much more radical. In a way, it's not in the sense that care is not just a question of it's not just a pragmatic question; it's an ontological question. So.
That's an amazing provocation also that I imagine has sort of risen as well from your own experience, and sort of to share with our viewers, Emmanuel. I know that you have sort of an orthodox path as a philosopher who grew up in an education system that privileges classical studies, but instead you spent your formative years studying agronomy and agriculture in Italy's farmland. Do you want to tell us about this experience and how it informs your thinking about ecology?
Yes. So I passed through this. I don't know what the word in English is. In German would be Umweg or Detour in French. So this very strange because normally people in Italy are used to go to the Liceo Classico, which is the school where you are supposed to study ancient Greek and Latin, and to have access to the best universities in the country. But for a very, very strange, in a way, feminist attitude of my mother actually sent my sister, my elder sister, to this Liceo Classico, to this elite school, and then to me and my brother, she said that we were not able to study and to have a real career in the university. So she obliged us to go into technical school. So and I found myself within this school for agriculture, so agricultural high school, which was at the time a very strange experience because it was sort of social exile. For at the time, it was really sort of a sign that you in a way you belong to the Salon des Refusés in society in Italy. So but it was extremely important for at least two reasons. First of all, because in a way, from an unconscious point of view, this experience was the imprinting of the idea that the first subject of culture are not human beings. So that culture has to be about non-human beings. So in the case of plants, but also animals, because when you're studying agronomy, you have to study a lot of animals too, so cows and pigs and so on. So in a way, the idea that knowledge as one privileged object, which is non-human beings. So that was so evident for me that for a long time I found boring to study human history or human sciences, because also because in a way it is extremely strange that all of us accept, in a way, all of us, we are all Darwinians, so we are all thinking that we are just an animal species, but we are all defending this division between natural sciences and human sciences. And in a way, we should perhaps come to the idea that humanities are just a part of zoology. So, but not in the sense that literature or philosophy are just, in a way, a question of atoms and molecules, but rather in the opposite sense, that in a way there is, in a way, also among animals, there is what we call philosophy or literature or art. So I can prove that there is a lot of art among animals. So that's the first consequence of this experience. The second consequence was the fact, perhaps, that because of the fact that I used to think that, or I used to consider non-human things as a privileged subject and object of science, but also knowledge in general, I was in a way obliged to think in a very pantheistic way that also there is knowledge, also there is a sort of cognitive subjectivity also among plants, non-human beings. And it was exactly the time when neurobiology started to, in a way, to present their provocative thesis. So it was, from this point of view, extremely important. But concerning ecology, it's not linked to your question, but I would stress perhaps this idea. Ecology is nowadays perhaps much more, or very often, actually an obstacle and not the way to solve our questions or our problems. And one of the main problem of the ecology, and I was, in a way, I was happy to come to ecology through agricultural sciences and not the opposite, because ecology, starting from its name, is obsessed by the idea of housing, home, of this very strange, in a way, metaphor or image of the relationship between living beings and space. So it's very strange to me, the fact that perhaps just because I was trained as an agronomist, to think that the relationship of non-human living beings to space has to be thought as home relationship, as habitat relationship, that is just projecting our cultural relationship to space to non-human beings. So one of the major tasks of our times, I would say, is to eradicate this metaphor, to in a way, to think, for instance, the relationship of living beings and space using political metaphors. For instance, the metaphors of public space, or the metaphors of a city, and not the metaphors of home, of an oikos. So there is no home in nature. Or we have experienced it during the quarantine. To stay at home all the time is the hell. It's not at all. So in a way, every time that we are using ecology in order to think that every living being has its own home and is spending its entire life at home, we are in a way we are condemning, or we are just thinking of the natural space as in a state of perpetual quarantine, which is horrible, which is something which is not beautiful at all. So sorry for this
No, and it's a beautiful detour as well, because I think it really brings forward this idea that also current ecological thought still very much relies on metaphors of perfect balance, of harmony and equilibrium,
Yeah,
which we saw during lockdown, that
yeah.
each one had different experiences and some of them quite problematic. So
Yeah, and also, if I may add to your point, what is interesting, because you quoted ecofeminists, what is important to stress is that the home is actually a very patriarchal space. So it's really the space
absolutely.
dominated by a male normally, and dominated by an order. So it's really something we have to, in a way, to quit. Also, the fact what is interesting from an historical point of view, the fact that ecology is dominated by this metaphor makes ecology very close to economy. So in a way, from an historical point of view, economy, political economy, so the economy of merchandise and ecology are really very close. They are using the same metaphors, the same epistemological frame. So we really have to change a lot of images and concepts when we are dealing with non-human life.
And I think one of the interesting proposals, one of the many interesting proposals in your book, is precisely what the role of contemporary art can add to this, what the artist, what the museum can add to it. And this is also an opportunity to bring in one of the questions that was brought up on YouTube by Riley Bell, who is asking us, I believe, probably to us both, that we were unable to travel to Riga because of COVID, and how do we draw a parallel between Metamorphosis and the exhibition concept of the biennial. So I will be very brief because I really want to hear your thoughts about this, Emmanuel, and specifically, I want to hear your thoughts about this idea of nature being a surrealist anticipation, which I thought was really strong in your book. So please tell us about it, and then we can talk a little bit about the exhibition as well.
So the idea was, so how can say it in a very short time in order to be not so boring. So the idea is the fact that actually, if you're looking, let's say that in this way, if you're looking to nature within the city, so how nature is represented within the city. Normally, nature is in a way accepted within the city only in a museal form, so under the form of a museum, under the form of, for instance, botanical gardens or a natural history museum. But that means that in a way, nature is always represented as something which has, or which is living always in a sort of immemorial past. So nature does not have life, does not have history. Nature belongs to past, and that is also there in a way the reflex of ecological thinking. We have to preserve nature. We have to in a way to let nature stay at the point of time we are witnessing to. So this is a very reactionary way of thinking nature. And one of the proposals I advanced in the book, but also outside the book, is actually to think about nature, to keep thinking under this museum metaphor, but using exactly the same metaphor or the same change that museums, in a way, passed through in the last 50 years. So museum used to be spaces where you were invited to focus or to contemplate human artifacts from the past. So the human material culture, but coming from a specific region, but from a history of this region. From the last 60 or 50 years, now there are a lot of contemporary art museums which are or biennials which are in a way which are now arisen, and in this institutions, museums has changed actually totally, because actually you go to contemporary art museums not to contemplate the past of human culture, but in a way to make an operation of divination of the future of human culture. So you go to a contemporary art museum in order to, in a way, to understand what will happen the day after tomorrow. So in a way, so it's really an exercise of divination within art, within culture. So, and the idea is would be, what would it be to have the same attitude for nature? So what would it be to, in a way, to acknowledge that nature not only has future but also agency, that non-human species are not just blocked to an age, to a past age, but they are able, exactly like us, to make out of their own body art, so to make it themselves different from their actual state, and to produce, in a way, modernity. So from this point of view, we could conceive cities as museum for contemporary nature. So where spaces where, in a way, non-human beings and human beings are, in a way, gathering together in order to accelerate evolution, in order to, in a way, to produce something or forms, living beings which are not existing, or which are not yet existing. So that would be the idea, the general idea. I can perhaps speak about that a little more, but I let you answer to your question, and then we can come back to this idea.
Absolutely, and I think one of this sort of thought of nature being its own avant-garde, and art being sort of a piece of divination, and an act of divination and summoning as well, because I think there's a lot of summoning and invocation that goes into perceiving, imagining otherwise. And with regards to this edition of Riboka 2, and it would have been such a pleasure for us to have seen it together. Really, a lot of the choices that Rebecca Lamarche Fadel, the chief curator, made for the exhibition speak to and speak with the environment. So rather than being that the environment being the object of a lot of the artworks, they are very much part, they compost, they fertilize the space. So one of the artists who I'm thinking it is actually trained in botany and medicine, Latvian Via Enine, who has planted healing plants all across the sort of derelict industrial port where the biennial, the exhibition venue of the biennial is. Edith Quint has a beautiful installation in which garlics ferment throughout the period of the biennial. And so there's a lot of processes, of organic processes within the artworks themselves that encourage not only thinking curatorially about what metamorphosis means in times of COVID-19, but also what it means to produce art as within the kind of the ruins, the fertile ruins of industrial modernity. What might we be able to give birth to out of an idea that is propelling us towards death and towards apocalyptic narratives, which is how our conversation with Emmanuel actually began as an invitation for this instance. But I know there is a burning question from David in the audience, and I wanted to give the opportunity for David to reach out to Emmanuel.
Hi, Manuel. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your talk, and I agreed with what you had to say. I hope what I say makes sense, but I kind of situate what you had to say in a Deleuzian philosophy of a plane of immanence, that everything is existing and within, which is kind of a strong opposition to an idea of transcendence, which everything beyond. But at the same time, your idea of metamorphosis, or the idea of metamorphosis, is this kind of transcendence, but within immanence in itself. So I don't really have a question, but I would just like to hear your pontifications about that, to just indulge in it more.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's really a huge question. It's a very beautiful question. You are totally right about the fact that there is this kind of dialectic between transcendence and immanence, and that metamorphosis is this kind of transcendence within immanence. You already in a way offered or delivered the best formulation of this idea. Thank you so much. I will use it and quote it, but I quote you. But I don't know how can I develop your idea. Perhaps just by coming back to a very perhaps common example. What does it mean to produce transcendence within immanence? It is perhaps what art every time produces, this kind of novelty within immanence. And what I wanted to say also before is the fact that we should perhaps start to consider that non-human beings are producing art. So really all the time. And I give you just one example. I could give you 2 examples, but we do not have time. Let's consider, for instance, just a field of flowers. So you normally consider this field of flowers as a purely mechanical or a blind product of evolution, but you're totally wrong, because in a way, as you know, flowers are actually sexual organs. And there is this I used to repeat this joke because it's really, really beautiful. I'm sorry, but if someone has already heard it, it's a joke by a very famous French botanist called Jean-Marie Pels, who used to remember that every time that you are offering flowers to someone, you are offering a collection of dicks and vagina to someone, so vegetal dicks and vagina, which is very strange. But so they are sexual organs, but they are organs made in a very special way, because the self-fertilization is impossible. So in order to have sex, plants have to, in a way, call individuals from another species. So for instance, insects. So they have sex through individual belonging not just to other species, to other kingdoms. So there is for instance bees. Let's say bees. So first of all, so the sexual experience. So it's a multi-specific experience for them. It's not just the experience of intimacy among 2 individuals of the same species. It's a very, very much more public, much more collective experience, sort of an orgy of different species. But what is more interesting to our question is the fact that since so through flowers, plants are just putting their own biological and genetical destiny in the hands of another species belonging to another kingdom. So in the hands of bees. So the bees are responsible of the evolution of flowers. But what is interesting is the fact that the choice of the bees are not based on calculus of biological functions or of biological fitness. So the choices of bees are based on taste or aesthetical judgment. They are just looking for sugar, so for self-enjoyment. That means that has a very interesting consequence for us. That means that the evolution of flowers in this field is much more close, or is closer to the evolution of artworks within human society than to, in a way, mechanical phenomenon. So in a way, you could say that this field of flowers is a sort of when you are looking to it on a temporal distance, is a sort of multi-specific biennial, so made by bees for themselves. So in a way, you have exactly the same processes we have, or the same attitude, the same relationship we have with our artifacts, or with flowers. You have exactly the same attitude also among non-human beings. So in a way, art does not begin with human beings. Art begins actually with life in general. So that, in order to give a conclusion to the question of immanence and transcendence, it's the perfect example of this dialectics, because on the one hand, everything is resolved, or everything takes place on the immanence of the relationship among different species, but this relationship between the different species can produce something which is totally new and totally, in a way, hazardous. So because of the fact that the criterium is an aesthetical criterium and not a biological one.
I think that there's also some, it complicates in very interesting ways the first stroke that was formulated by the French botanist about the sexual organs, because it really brings about this idea of anatomical identity, which you began with being completely irrelevant to the formulation and continuation of and continuity of life. So there's a couple questions on YouTube that I would like to bring on, and one of them is really $1 million question. When will there be a translation in English for Metamorphosis?
I mean, it will appear in next year. I mean, it's Robin Cake who is translating it. So the one who found it, actually, the Urbanomic Press publishing house. So I'm very happy that he's translating. I'm very honored that he's translating his book. Concerning the time, I think in spring or summer of next year, but I'm not. So English publishing houses are very slow. So I do not know when they are publishing the book, when the book is coming out, but it is under translation.
So that's good news for Ashley England. And Odalis Valdevicio, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, but fantastic aesthetic comparison between flowers, bees, human artworks. And I think we do agree with Odalis and the idea that a multi-specific biennial might be an interesting institutional template for what we have now. So I suppose to end and to wrap up our conversation, a huge thank you to you all, to your wonderful team, for allowing us to be here in this very hybrid model between countries, between virtual spaces, physical spaces. And a huge thank you to you, Manuel, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in person soon.
Me too.
And until then, do keep in touch. Thank you, everyone, for connecting with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.